for Russia in the coming few weeks in the Kherson region for that grouping of the Russian troops, reinforced grouping.
Why? Why do you say that?
Why reinforced?
In Kherson. Yeah. Why is defeat looming?
Yes, grouping is reinforced. When Ukraine announced that this is the main direction, new units were brought there. But the more units are brought there, the more supplies you need to deliver. And the bridges are constantly under fire, constantly destroyed. The grouping is effectively trapped and is degraded very, very quickly. Even if the terrain is not very favorable for a breakthrough, it's very flat, very open. You cannot camouflage your forces, and the air power still is a significant factor. Nevertheless, the degrading of this grouping proceeds very fast, and there is no way to retreat. You cannot present it as a redeployment of the grouping. It's going to be a rout.
Because they can't get across the Dnieper.
They cannot get across the Dnieper. The bridges are blocked. Supplies are not coming. Without supplies, it's increasingly difficult to resist Ukrainian push. And Ukrainians are not rushing it. They're probing a little bit here, probing there from different directions. In one of the places, they are certain to find a weak spot and then break through much the same way as we observed in the Kharkiv region, only with the difference that there Russians had a clear way of retreat. And here, no way, River Dnieper is too wide. And so that route is certain to resonate far stronger even than the events we observed in September. Yes, what can we how can we construct a scenario out of this point of departure? A retreat is happening in a matter of a few weeks, a defeat is happening in a matter of a few weeks, which is impossible to hide. And it is entirely possible to construct scenarios of this sort of catastrophe, of that sort of catastrophe, of nuclear catastrophe, of kind of a breakdown of Russia's rupture, as it said here, a very good book, Janusz. What I'm trying to think about is how to establish a kind of range of options on non-catastrophic defeat. Russia, yes, it is very good at self-destruction. There is a established track record. You look at Russia history, you will find all sorts of examples. Finding a way out of this defeat that would not signify a Russian civil war, collapse of the Russian state, is not that easy, I would say. But then a disaster is too easy to predict, but it's also in many ways a very negative way of thinking, so to say. Nobody needs this disaster, even Ukraine, where you can hear voices arguing along the line that Russia is the cartridge which must be destroyed. Well, you're thinking about what that would mean, and you start thinking, probably we'd rather not. Probably we need to see whether it is possible to manage this disaster, which is not going to be an act, a total capitulation, which is going to be a process. The process of this defeat must be kind of manageable. That's, I think, a task we need to focus on. And I think two key conditions are essential for this sort of thinking. First, that there is no first nuclear use. And I think that despite all Putin's rhetoric, despite all the discourse, this condition is entirely realistic. Russia is not really preparing its non-strategic nuclear forces for a first use. I rely only on open sources. I don't have access to classified intelligence, but what I see that all the nuclear warheads remain as they did for the last 31 years under lock in the 12 centralized storages. That was the last thing Gorbachev did, make sure that they are locked there. And there is no physical activity around these storages. There is no preparation for using them. That's a big difference, by the way, from the Cuban Missile Crisis. where there was really a lot of physical things related to nuclear warheads. Here we have only words. Words matter, I agree, but it's rather complicated.
But you're referring to strategic.
No,
nukes.
non-strategic.
You're turning to non-strategic.
Strategic nukes are a different story. Yes.
So you're saying there's no signs of strategic nukes?
No, I'm saying no signs of non-strategic nukes, because they are locked in these 12 centralized storages for 30 plus years. That was going to be two initiatives taken at the same time by President Bush Sr. and Mikhail Gorbachev to make sure that all non-strategic warheads are stored. So not a single officer in the Russian military has experience, first-hand experience in handling non-strategic warheads. And nobody is really doing anything to go on with this training for what we can observe. Centralized storages doesn't mean that they are Moscow and beyond Urals. One of these storages is in fact in Belgorod region, frontline. But nevertheless, it is safely locked. And the task of making preparations for real-time use of non-strategic warheads is rather complicated. You need a lot of untrained heads on extremely sensitive assets. It is, and many of these officers who are going to be performing these tasks would be very hesitant to follow these orders. So it is not that easy for Mr. Putin to give this order. It's not about pushing the proverbial red button. And strategic weapons you're asking about. Yes, that's a different story. They are generally
the ICBMs.
Yeah, ICBMs and strategic submarines, for that matter. They are in situation of readiness. That's about the red button and a very short chain of command, but they are unsuitable for the situation.
So this idea that Putin might use a tactical nuke in Ukraine, you would have to see signs of that first. In other words, he's just not going to start throwing tactical nukes. He's going to do some messaging first, right?
It's not only messaging.
Like blowing up Nord Stream.
It's really blowing up Nord Stream in this regard is an interesting exercise in kind of hybrid war, where you probably bomb your own asset in order to send a message. I don't think we probably can quite.
But with a nuclear test at Novaya Zemlya, would that be, if you were looking for a sign that he's getting ready to use nukes, they've long been suspected of not testing nuclear weapons, and there's been expectations they might do something in Novaya Zemlya. So that would be what you're kind of hinting at.
There were also simulations and experiments with micro, but you really need to test one of the warheads which were under store for that long time. Nuclear test would be very clear sign of preparations and also a message in its own right, which is certain to create a big resonance, but it's also not something you can do very fast. Moving a nuclear warhead to Novaya Zemlya, you cannot hide that in modern technologies. It is, again, a rather complicated logistical operation. So one of my propositions is that there is no nuclear first use, because I agree that with the kind of discourse coming from Washington, D.C., that any attempt at nuclear use will be catastrophic for Russia. Very probable. And since I want to think about non-catastrophic options, I break it out. My second condition is rather more, even more, I would say, problematic, because I think that until Putin remains in power, Russia is firm set on the course of national catastrophe. If you want to think about non-catastrophic options, it means no Putin. How it's going to happen, that's a different line of argument. Russian history provides all sorts of examples, but logically, when for a very large part of Russian leadership, it's plain clear that the problem is of colossal proportion, and the central part of the problem is that particular person. A way to remove that central part of the problem will be found. It's hard to say how, but it may happen very soon. As the disaster in Kherson would strike, there will be a need to explain away the defeat in the war. The easiest way to explain it away is to pin it on a person. That it's Putin's war, he's responsible, it's his defeat. That's the way forward for any post-Putin leadership. And that opens up all sorts of opportunities for Ukraine, for the West, but it also opens up all sorts of side effects in Russia's immediate neighborhood. And all these dynamics would inevitably interplay. Ukraine might be very tempted to exploit the opportunity of Russia's weakness to press harder. The development of Putin's removal would be a huge shock in Belarus, for that matter, where Lukashenko is so personally dependent on that. New explosion of protests in Belarus entirely probable, and the enforcers, Lukashenko's security services, will be quite demoralized with what happened in Moscow. We now know that the protests of 2020 had very little chance of success, simply because Russia was there with capabilities to do the same thing as it's now doing in Ukraine. These capabilities are now spent. No help is coming from Moscow, even if the post-Putin leadership would fancy that. There will be quite probably many troubles in the Caucasus. Some of these troubles are already starting. We see the new tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan going on. Azerbaijan is very keen to exploit its position of power with the help of Turkey, but that's a little bit in a particular case. We have Chechnya, where Ramzan Kadyrov positions himself as Putin's infantryman. Without Putin, he will be eager to play his own game. There was Georgia, which lost control over its two provinces, and will be pressing hard to get them back. And again, Chechnya might come into that fray. Another kind of seat of instability. Things might be happening in Central Asia, where we have seen very recently clashes between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where Russia used to play a role of security provider of kind, including earlier this year in Kazakhstan. No chance for playing this role anymore. So there will be impacts coming on Moscow from these directions. The new post-Putin leadership, quite probably a collective leadership. I don't think any single person could step into his shoes. Will be very unstable. There will be all sorts of shifts and changes in this leadership, as we saw after Stalin's death, probably. And again, the desire to put responsibility on that person, to hold this person responsible for the loss of Belarus, will be obviously there. It is possible to expect that the new post-Putin leadership would be more conservative, more nationalistic, more kind of hard-driven, but any leadership will have to deal with the unfolding disaster in the economy, in the neighborhood, in Ukraine. And this is a situation where any kind of leadership will be pressed to make new compromises with Ukraine, with the West, in the neighborhood. So there is a path there, path of compromises, which can be incentivized by the West, which can be kind of compelled by the West in a different categories. We generally know all these people who are now there in Moscow, in the Kremlin's proverbial corridors. They are not really any of them statesmen of incredible profile. They are all very corrupt. They are all very dirty. It will be no fun to do business with them. Nevertheless, it's still much different game from negotiating with Mr. Putin, who is so obsessed with Ukraine, who is so paranoid about the West, who is so self-centric, and I think obsession with his own health, which obviously increased during the long self-isolation. makes it next to impossible to have a meaningful conversation with them, not to mention deal. It will be different with post-Putin leadership. Yes, we know these characters. They will try to play hardball in any case, but they will be also very interested in regaining access to their own fortunes sanctioned by the West, which makes it a little bit easier to incentivize them to make compromises on the most important theater in Ukraine, to go make this concession, that concession, starting certainly with the returning to status quo until February 23, proceeding further. I think the main problem on this track of gradual compromises will be Crimea. That is a case which is very difficult to handle for Russia. A lot of emotions attached to that, not only on the Ukrainian side, but on the Russian side as well. If it will be possible to postpone the solution of this problem for into some near future, it will make progress on other tracks much easier. My last point is about China. In this city is always a question, and what about China? And my point is that in this development, China is pretty much irrelevant, as it has been irrelevant in the 7 months of this war. It is sitting on the fence, is saying something positive to Putin, but not really making any material difference. They want this war to end as soon as possible. They didn't like the start of the war. They didn't like the course of the war. Yes, China will, Xi Jinping personally will be very upset with Putin's departure, but generally upset doesn't change much. China wouldn't be able to make much difference on this track, counterintuitive as it might seem. It seems China is such a great power. It always makes a difference. Probably we need to start thinking about China not as a rising power, but as a stagnant power, and that's a difference. And I will stop here. It's more time than was allocated to me, but then I was delayed by technicalities.
That's fine. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Andrei, are we on this course for a post-Putin collective leadership? I mean, he raises a very interesting question about the future of Russia. What about the impact on the economy and mobilization? What's on your mind? What right now is what is making you think about this in a different way?
First of all, Glen, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, interesting panel, and to have a chance to share with colleagues and friends my thoughts on the current development. You asked me about the post-Putin, whatever, Russia and so on, but I don't share the view. I think that we're still quite far from that stage yet. So, since we are not there, and frankly speaking, I don't see for the moment that we will be there anytime soon. So, with your permission, I would try to spend some of my time on attracting attention of colleagues to the nature of this war first, and what nature of this war and some periods of this war would tell us about the state of mind in Kremlin. I would prefer to use this term better than Russia, because there is looks like it's only Kremlin has a.
Is it correct to call it the party of war when you talk about mentality in the Kremlin?
I would prefer Kremlin, and after that we would discuss what kind of parties do exist there and what are different between that. It's just so far we can see what we can see. It's more or less consolidated position. So far we did not hear much about some diverse view or different views. We did not hear that Mr. Patrushev would express something very much different from Mr. Putin or Mr. Medvedev. Probably he's slightly different, but it's a very different story, as we all understand. But nevertheless, okay, let's come first of all just for better understanding the war. I think it's very important. Especially, I would start with a short remark concerning the title of our session, which is, as you can see, the first part, the war in Ukraine. I do see the very clear impact of the Kremlin propaganda war that has impact on a wonderful, beloved, and respectful Jamestown Foundation. Because this is exactly the
They
truth.
love Janusz's book, by the way.
All right, okay, so our best friends sometimes happen to be under the impact of this propaganda machine. Because, no, but in the Janusz book, I don't see I see guide to Russia's rupture, but I don't see war in Ukraine. But war in Ukraine, the very term
It's
war in
causing the
Ukraine-
rupture.
No, the war in Ukraine, this term is a Kremlin's term.
Yeah.
Because Kremlin wanna us, everybody around the world, think that this is the Ukrainian war, or in the worst case, the war in Ukraine. They do not like the real term, which is war against Ukraine, or Russian-Ukrainian war, or Russian war against Ukraine, or Kremlin war against Ukraine. And this is a very important. So that they are persistent in using this term, and actually many Western journalists and experts and politicians kind of for short term using the term Ukraine war, which is in substance is absolutely wrong, because it's not Ukraine war. Ukraine did not start this war. Ukraine is a victim of the aggression, and just by doing this, Kremlin is trying to some kind of deviate attention, kind of to move attention from the real aggressor, from the real launcher of this war to the victim of this war. So that is why I would suggest to all our friends and colleagues, try to avoid the Kremlin's terminology that sometimes is much easier to use, like they did it with Georgian war, Russian-Georgian war. They refer to the 5 days war. It's another, some kind of the linguistic aggression against victims of aggression. So that was Russian-Georgian war, or Kremlin war against Georgia. Here we're dealing with the Kremlin war against Ukraine, or Russian-Ukrainian war as the best case. So this is the very first remark. Second, my remark would be concerning stages of this war. So far, I see 3 main stages in this war. The first stage was definitely from February 24th. I mean, just this last period of this long Russian-Ukrainian war, because we understand the Russian-Ukrainian war has been launched on February 20th, year 2014, with the beginning of operation that Minister of Defense of Russia, Shoigu, has coined the particular medal for so-called liberation of Crimea. And he just mentioned the beginning of this operation, February 20th, 2014. If we're talking about conventional war of Russia or of Kremlin against Ukraine has been launched on February 20th, 2014. So this war is going on already for more than 8 years, 8.5 years. So now we're talking about the latest stage of this war that has been launched, as we all know, from February 24th, 2022. We were talking about this particular period, or particular stage of this war. So I see 3 main periods. The first period of this latest stage of the war is from February 24th until late March. That I would call it, for myself, it's a blitzkrieg. It's a plan of Putin to do with the 1 striking or 9 striking hits to capture substantial portion of Ukrainian territory, decapitate Ukrainian government, to capture Kyiv. We all know this. So this is the first period. Second period was from late March, maybe March 30th, up to September 21st. And I call this as a war of attrition. And through this period, it was quite clear that Putin was absolutely ready for long-term warfare. According to the number of documents that appeared over this more than 5 months period, it looks like that he was prepared at least for 3-year war until the beginning or mid of 2025. If we look into the so-called grain deal concluded in Istanbul, the duration of this deal is 3 years. If we look on the number of foreign exchange reserves of the Russian central bank, it's going to be used with the current speed of expenses approximately for 3 more years. There are many other indications that Putin was prepared and was ready for so-called relatively low intensity warfare, low compared to the first period, compared to Blitzkrieg. So for long war of attrition. And this second period can be divided into sub-periods. The first sub-period will be war of attrition with Russian offensive that continued until approximately August 25th. And the war of attrition with Ukrainian counteroffensive starting with on August 25th until today. But the third period of this war seems to me has been launched on September 21st with the Putin's speech, infamous speech with his decisions on referenda in the occupied territories, with mobilization, with again nuclear threats at new level and so on. And we need to understand why all of a sudden, after 5 months of the war of attrition that looks like were quite suitable for Putin, all of a sudden he has changed radically his views, his mindset, and he completely changed his attitudes and his policy toward the war, because the third period can be called whatever. I would put a final blow or something like that, that's kind of his preparations for some kind of overwhelming attack again on Ukraine with all possible forces, including nuclear, including using Belarusian territory, including mobilization of additional either 300,000 or 500,000 or 1 million or several million people. It's absolutely different from what we have seen in the previous five months. So, and we need to understand what happened, because it's a radical change in the strategy of the war. And I would mention several points that would be probably helpful in this setting. First of all these bunch of actions that we have heard about happened within 3 days, from September 19th to September 21st. Neither before and after that, only some kind of corrections, additions, attachments, but nothing. So all decisions have been announced within these 3 days. So it means, and even just for example, such decisions like referendum, just week before, all Kremlin mass media were talking about the referendum will be held in the best case at the end of the year, or might be even in 2023. And everybody was preparing for that. And for example, the captured documents for Kharkiv referendum clearly stated that the referendum in Kharkiv region should be held on from November 1st to November 7th. So there was no talk, any talk about the referenda from September 23 to September 27th. So
those are the captured documents for Kharkiv, or
no, it's a Ukrainian captured documents on preparation of Kharkiv referendum.
Which city? Kharkiv?
Kharkiv region. Kharkiv has not been captured, and hopefully will never be captured. But for the Kharkiv region, they prepared the very detailed documents how to organize referendum, and they just all details how it is prepared, and they definitely we should know that they know the results of the referendum. They published it already, and they were saying when the referendum will be held from November 1st to November 7th, and they published the number of people who will participate and the rate, the number of people who would vote yes. Just everything is already known. So, but what is important? So they were planning in the very best case in November, not in October, not even in September. For other regions, they even we don't know yet, but they were talking about either December, November, December, or next year. So there is something, and that was just really on September 30th. You can see the Russian media talking about the referendum next year. So it means that something has happened within a very short period of time after September 13th and before September 19th. What exactly might happen in this short period of time? And because this bunch of decisions have been announced from September 1921, so that is why the latest time that such decisions could be taken is September 17th to September 18th. What is this date? This is the date when Mr. Putin returned from Samarkand, from the summit of Shanghai Security Organization. And that means that the decisions, the basic strategic decisions that he has taken with he himself and with his friends and colleagues and entourage, it has been heavily influenced what he has learned, what he has heard, what he has been recommended, or what he interpreted in Samarkand. And definitely we can look into Samarkand and we can think about who might influence Mr. Putin's decision-making process. And probably it would be not hard to make our conclusion that it probably was a chairman of China.
So you think it was
China, it was Xi Jinping, and the discussion with him and the conversation with him. And if you look into the two press releases that Kremlin published and China published, Chinese office, it is a very clear inconsistencies, kind of mismatch from all these two press releases, which actually supported this view that it was a conversation with Xi Jinping has very substantial influence on the Putin's decision-making process. And since then, we have seen, which we can look at, for example, for press releases of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, it's very clearly saying what is China's position on the Russian-Ukrainian war. And it's not, we don't need to kind of to fantasize, it's kind of, it's official statement of the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs. China would like to finish this war as soon as possible. That's very clear statement. And moreover, today, Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs actually published something that I never seen before. China's Minister of Foreign Affairs published the statement in which China called Ukraine as strategic partner of China. And in the conversation between Putin and Xi Jinping, Putin was talking about strategic relations between Russia and China, and the response from Xi Jinping was rather cool, some kind of rather cold, and said, okay, we would probably use some kind of strategic context like telephone conversation. So it's a very different meaning of the word strategic. So and one more important moment needs to be mentioned. Mr. Patrushev, Security Council's Secretary of Russia, has been immediately dispatched from Moscow to Beijing on probably in the night, from the night of September 17th to September 18th. And he arrived in Beijing late afternoon, September 18th, and held 2 days conversations and negotiations with the Chinese partners. It looks like he was informing the Chinese side about the decisions that had been taken in Moscow the day before. And according to all these press releases, it looked like that just Putin promised to Comrade Xi to inform him about his decision, and the best way to do it, he sent Mr. Patrushev to Beijing to do this business. And that is because he was in Beijing on September 18th and 19th. It was exactly before those decisions have been announced in Moscow, especially assuming the time difference between Beijing and Moscow. So altogether, taken all together, it looks like that in the conversation between Putin and Xi Jinping, it was, I don't know what is the kind of the style and the form and the shape of this conversation, but it looks like it has been said It was recommended, it was expressed as a desire or wish or something like that, that this war should be finished as soon as possible. Having gotten this information from his so-called strategic partner, Mr. Putin came to the conclusion that he could not get, for example, weapons from China. As we know, China does not provide weapons to Russia. Mr. Putin looks like he decided to move to the much faster conclusion of some kind of settlement, some kind of deal, and just to preserve the best possible conditions for that deal. He tried to raise stakes as much as possible, as high as possible, with mobilization, with his speech, with a referendum, with a threat of nuclear, just to scare as much as possible, not so much Ukraine, because we understand Ukrainians are not scared even of nuclear threats, and they're ready to fight regardless what will be, what could happen with them, but scare as much as possible the Western partners of Ukraine, including the current US administration and some other governments in Europe, just to force them to use their pressure on Ukrainian governments and on Ukrainian society and Ukrainian military force to be ready to some settlement, some deal. And that is why he understands that probably at this moment, Russian troops has captured most of Ukrainian territory, and it would be rather hard to get more territory. So that is why it's necessary to fix what they've gotten already, because it would be rather hard, very bloody, and maybe not guaranteed to get something more. So that is why what we have seen over the last, 10 days or so, it looks like it is a, once again, this is a version, it's not a guarantee. I was not in Kremlin those days. Okay, so it looks like that it is a last attempt, or kind of the most seriously prepared event of a highest possible bluff, highest possible blackmail of the Western partners and allies of Ukraine in order to achieve exactly what Chairman Xi Jinping suggested, but on his Putin's terms. So it might be the kind of the movement moving to the finalization of this conflict, but on his burst terms. So that's at least my reading of the current events, and the current reconstruction of Belarusian railway also adds to that element. This is an element of psychological warfare, just to scare as much as possible, and that is why to exert the best possible conditions for potential settlement. So stopping with these three periods, I will just probably comment a little bit on what Pavel has said, because my view about it is slightly different from yours, and just let's discuss what is common, what is different. So I don't think that Russia is losing the war, and I don't think that Russia has this slow-moving defeat. So far, seems to me, it will took just purely military point of view. So it just does not look that there is a the war itself, the military warfare, has reached a turning point. We don't know yet, because we can know it only post factum. We cannot do it in the process. Only after some events that happens, we can say yes or no. But for the moment, we don't see that the line of front line did not change much, with one exception of Kharkiv counteroffensive, which is again is not a clear Ukrainian victory. This is a organized retreat of Russian troops done by according to the Putin's order. That's absolutely clear. That's a political decision to withdraw all Russian troops from Kharkiv region west of Oskol River without fight. such important centers like Kupiansk, a railway center and a road center, has been given to Ukrainians without a single shot. Such important center like Izium, with the concentration, with the territory that has been should be used as attack, pincer attack in the rear of Ukrainian forces in Donbass, has been given without a single shot. In Kupiansk, there was a staff quarters of 3 armies, 2 some kind of the regular whatever infantry armies, and the other the first Guards tank army, the best tank army in the whole Russian forces. So that substantial centers have been given to Ukrainians without a single shot. Moreover, if you look into the north of Kharkiv region, like Veliky Burluk, Volchansk, and Kazachia Lopan, there's a very substantial defensive construction that have been created by Russian forces during 6 months of occupation. Ukrainian troops were 80 kilometers from those positions. They have been abandoned by Russian troops. So not only without any shots, Ukrainians were 80 kilometers from those places, and they have been abandoned and left to Ukrainians. So all of this suggests that very clearly that it was a political decision by Kremlin, by Putin, to liberate, okay, those territories and withdraw troops.
Liberate usually use that.
Right.
Liberate
in both ways, it would be correct. Okay, liberate. Okay, so, and also probably last point here, I would use, I would mention that just if we look on the number and the content, what the Ukrainians were able to capture during the counter, this Kharkiv counter-offensive, so it looks like 10, in the best case, 15% of the equipment that Russian troops had in this region. So between 85 to 90% of the equipment Russians withdrew, and almost all troops withdrew without substantial losses and without POW. So that is why it was organized retreat according to the Putin's plan. If it will be interested, we can discuss why he should do it. He did it. So my probably last point here about the military operation will be, since I don't see the turning point in the war, and this is a very important element, whether kind of the tide of war moved still on the Russian side or moved to the Ukrainian side, I still don't see turning point so far. And I would see such a turning point if and when not something that will happen with Liman, because it's a secondary or even second of layer front. It's not important strategically, regardless how much blood has been spilled over there. Not even Kherson, not even the kind of the right bank of Dnieper. The most important, this kind of center of gravity of this war is Melitopol, Berdyansk, and Mariupol. So that is why the most important just for everybody to look into the line of Russian defense or Russian offensive between Vasilievka on Kakhovska reservoir on Dnieper to Pologi to Donetsk. This is an almost straight line from west to east. And this is the most important line in this war. If Ukrainians would be able to break this line and to get to Melitopol, to liberate Melitopol, liberate Berdyansk and Mariupol, and to get to Sea of Azov, that would be a sign of the turning point in this war. That would be a very clear sign that the tide of war shifted to Ukrainians' favor. Thank you.
You had a very interesting point about organized retreat, because one of the things that I asked my Ukrainian friends about was, with this Kharkiv offensive, counteroffensive, why is it if it was a defeat and seizure of so much territory, which say 3,000 kilometers of territory, what they say 8,000,
yeah.
But why don't we see videos of Russian captured POWs? Because you would expect you would see many videos of if it's successful counteroffensive, you're going to see a lot of POWs. obviously, but there weren't any. And so what you said was a very interesting point. I haven't heard anybody kind of argue that it was an organized retreat. Now, that sounds good maybe from the Kremlin's public relations perspective, but that's a fair point, what you say. So something, to take into consideration. We'll stop on that note because we have many diverse perspectives here today. And so we're going to have another perspective because, many believe that the war is at a turning point now, or maybe the Kharkiv counteroffensive was a turning point in the war. It's certainly the Kherson offensive is and will be a decisive moment in the war. But with the mobilization occurring inside of Russia, you have 80,000, close to 100,000 Russians going to Kazakhstan to avoid mobilization order, 50,000 flooding Georgia, the impact on the economy in Russia, losing all this very intellectual capital, people leaving their jobs because they're afraid to serve and to fight and die in Donbass, certainly doesn't look well for the future of Russia. So on that note, and given Janusz's title of his new book is A Guide to Russia's Rupture, and he raises a fair point about the Kremlin war against Ukraine. What does it mean for Russia, Janusz?
Yeah, if I could add to Andrei, there's another possibility, which is a disorganized retreat. And it reminds me a little bit of how Serbs fled the Krajina after occupying it for several years. And then when confronted by a much more superior force in this particular area, they actually fled. I mean, not in a particularly organized way, but any way they could, even ahead of the local population. But to answer your question, Glenn, I'm sorry my book is not here. Maybe it was hijacked by the FSB for a book burning event, I don't know. But let me highlight sort of 5 points.
And the book is available online
It
on
is
the Jamestown
available,
website
yep,
for all those watching today.
PDF, and there'll be a Ukrainian version coming out in October as well in Kyiv. But let me make I've got 15 minutes, so let me make about 5 points about the book, because I just want to outline it. By the way, I finished the book 3 weeks before Russia's extended invasion of Ukraine. The editor allowed me to make some limited updates, but I do believe actually the war reinforced many of the points, my thesis in the book, and it's actually exacerbated Russia's internal failures, accelerated them. So let me start with one. The first one, Russia's weak foundations. People ask me, isn't Russia too big to fail? Well, it's actually smaller than the Soviet Union, which was much more powerful country than the Russian Federation. Russia's rupture, I don't think will happen overnight. I think Pavel mentioned this, but it has so many of the ingredients for a prolonged period of dissolution. It's been unable to transform itself into a nation state, a civic state. It's not even a stable imperial state, as we see in its actions abroad. It's riven by disputes internally between statist imperialists, ethno-nationalists, Soviet restorers, pan-Slavist, Eurasianists, not even to mention all the liberals, Democrats, federalists, regionalists. It has numerous economic, demographic, and social weaknesses, which I do detail in the book. And they've been intensified, I would say, by a convergence of factors. Over-dependence on fossil fuel exports, contracting economy, particularly in the light of sanctions, stark socioeconomic inequalities, demographic decline, especially among key sectors of the population, and depopulation outside of European Russia, widening disparities between Moscow and diverse republics and regions, suppression of ethnic and regional identities, a precarious, increasingly precarious, I'd say, political pyramid based on personalism and clientelism, deepening distrust of government institutions, increasing public alienation from a corrupt and self-serving ruling elite, escalating military casualties and war expenditures, and of course, economically damaging international sanctions, which, as Pavel mentioned, are going to have to be revised, the extent of the damage that we envisage. The whole question of energy exports as well, it's something that maybe our two experts here to talk about as well. But certainly I would say that Europe is weaning itself away from dependence on Russian energy, regardless of whether Nord Stream 2 was sabotaged or not. And if it was, then I think it's a perfect demonstration of Russia sawing off the branch that it's been sitting on. Second point, what are Russia's alternatives? I believe that in the midst of crippling economic sanctions and potential military defeat, and we can argue what defeat means and how long it will take, I think the hopes among liberals that Russia can develop into a democracy and remain intact appears, I believe, it's increasingly illusory. Support for the Putin regime, it may be strong. We don't know if it's wide. We don't know how deep it is. I think it can shift rapidly among a disoriented and currently largely passive or fearful public. But there is little evidence that Russia is on the verge of a peaceful democratic upsurge. I think much more likely is a series of institutional and intra-elite struggles over power and resources, which we may actually already be witnessing in various mysterious deaths of officials, oligarchs, simmering disputes over the conduct of the war between military and FSB, as well as increasing public and regional disquiet in the light of Moscow's economic failures and its recent mobilization campaign. Putin's ouster, whenever it happens, can itself contribute to the turmoil and precipitate even more widespread political and social conflicts. There could be some collective leadership, but we don't remember have a communist party anymore that kept a lot of this together in the past. That's gone. I think that if internal security seem to be weakening and the war in Ukraine is failing, we may witness military mutinies, angry armed veterans returning from the front, with the prospects for violence, crime, sabotage, and ungovernability spreading. And when the state is viewed as weakening, where it cannot provide security, the vacuum will be filled by alternatives. My third point, in terms of the rupture, I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's outlined very extensively in the book. But let me just make this one point. At a strategic level, the extensive invasion of Ukraine and seizure of territory shows that you're right, Andrei, the Kremlin does not respect the international borders of any neighboring states. However, I would say this imperial overreach can rebound on Russia itself, as the country's external and internal borders will also become increasingly disputed by various republics, regions, as well as by some neighbors. If Crimea and Donbass can re-separate from Russia, then why not other territories seized by Moscow in the past? Particularly as the state continues to weaken. And I think that the nature of the rupture itself, and I go into a lot of detail over a couple of chapters in the book, will be very diverse. In some cases, it will be peaceful. In some cases, violent. A mixture of both the Soviet and Yugoslav scenarios, both of which I remember very vividly in the 1990s. I won't go into detail because I chronicle all this in my book. But what will emerge from it? We may have long-term chaos in some places. We may have some states emerging, seeking international legitimacy. Some states or regions may form loose confederations. There's been a history of this in the past during the breakdown of the Tsarist Empire, in particular during the long civil wars within the former Russian empires. Several may become embroiled in territorial and ethnic conflicts, as we are still witnessing in parts of the Western Balkans, the South Caucasus and Central Asia, where the congruence between territory and ethnicity still has not been settled. Fourth, Western policy, and I do devote, again, a whole chapter to this. I think we should be making contingency plans for a very disruptive period in which, the war in Ukraine is one thing, but or let's say the attack on Ukraine is one thing, but what it will precipitate in Russia itself, I don't think we're prepared for. And there are both dangers and opportunities, how to handle this without being directly involved and being blamed for the conflict. Now, I think Western approach is based on these persistent fears about Russia's state failure, about its dissolution. I think that's one of the reasons we didn't arm Ukraine properly at the beginning. This sort of piecemeal drip by drip, drop by drop or drip by drip assistance to Ukraine, whereas they were crying out for the sort of weaponry that they have now so they could prevent further capture of territory. I think one of the reasons is there was a fear of Russia, which I think is the real Russophobia, fear of Russia somehow dissolving. And it reminds me of the profound anxieties that I was here in Washington in the early 90s, the anxieties displayed by the US government and other governments during the disintegration of the Soviet Union. in the early 90s. So I think basing policy on the avoidance of particular consequences is very counterproductive. It encourages the Kremlin or empowers the Kremlin to exploit Western fears to its advantage. In reality, I think Moscow will be less capable of projecting its imperial agenda when its military capabilities reduced, its economic resources diminished, elite power struggles intensified, state institutions challenged, and citizens less acquiescent. So last point, what is to be done? I think, first of all, Russia's European neighbors must be provided with all upgraded security instruments and weapon systems to shield themselves from any destabilizing scenarios that Moscow may attempt to engineer to deflect attention from its own implosion. And I think they will do that for sure, to strike at neighbors. I'm not sure whether they're going to provoke NATO or not. That would be, I suppose, foolhardy, and I don't think they're about to commit suicide. Nevertheless, there could be acts of sabotage, there could be some provocations against neighbors. I think that Russia's offensive capabilities, already crippled in Ukraine, will further deteriorate when the defensive capabilities of US allies and partners are strengthened. Now, Western policymakers, I think, must also benefit from Russia's internal vulnerabilities. Look, Moscow will claim, and it has been for years, that Washington is trying to break up Russia. We heard this in the 90s, not just the Soviet Union, but the Russian Federation. So no amount of denial will change that accusation. It's like denying that NATO threatens you. If they want to believe it, they're going to believe it, or they act as though they believe it anyway. So it doesn't make any difference. So instead of these pointless verbal defensiveness, which one hears from various Western administrations, I think we need to seize the narrative. Seize the narrative as something positive, as we did during the Cold War. We need to go on the PR offensive. Russia needs democracy, pluralism, regional devolution, and genuine federalism to save its economy and re-establish relations with a rich and powerful West. And if a democratic transformation becomes improbable, Washington will support the rights of republics and regions to determine their own sovereignty and statehood, as it did belatedly with the Soviet republics. Now, again, this can help embolden at least some citizens within Russia, demonstrate that they are not isolated on the world stage, but it will take that narrative away from the Kremlin. It's always us, the Russophobes, that are attacking them, not their own policies that are driving this country towards disaster. So again, I'm not going to go into details of how I envisage the different breakups. Very last point, I would say this: seize the future, do not fear it. We were not prepared for the collapse of the Soviet bloc or the Soviet Union, and we were very slow to offer support and cooperation. I would say even the countries that were emerging from the Soviet bloc were very fearful of what the Soviets could do. I don't think they realized the independence and the strength that they were accumulating. I remember even in Poland, they were very wary about joining NATO at the beginning. What would be the Russian reaction? Would you want us in NATO? So we've got to seize the initiative. And last point I would say is the formation of new states from failed empires is a process visible throughout history when loyalty to the existing state dissipates and new forms of sovereignty are increasingly supported. It is worth remembering that only a few years before its collapse, communism was evidently invincible. And the Soviet Union was engaged in numerous foreign policy escapades. It controlled half of Europe. It trumpeted its economic superiority over the West while disguising its growing existential crisis. And I think Russia is a much weaker state whose decline accelerates each day and whose status quo is merely transient. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Great points going forward, Janusz, for us to consider and think about. I'm sure we don't know which direction it's going, but that leads me to ask our Pavel and Andrei, our Russian perspectives. It certainly leads the mobilization and some of the opposition in Dagestan and other places, and then reports today that Gaidar is going to send his forces into Dagestan to enforce the mobilization, which won't sit well with many Dagestanis. And by that, I mean Dagestan is a multi-ethnic republic. But you can make that argument, right, Andrei and Pavel? I mean, that there's the mobilization is going to cause social friction and discontent.
Yes, absolutely. And signs of this friction and discontent are plentiful. And I think it's not only the mobilization as such, which came as a shock for the Russian society, which causes all sort of rupture, particularly since in some republics, like, I don't know, Buryatia, like Tuva, a lot of male population is in fact drafted. The republics are becoming on the verge of demographic catastrophe. But it came as a huge shock to Moscow, where all the state discourse was the special operations were going according to plan. No need to any change. Then mobilization, entirely unprepared. Much the same way as the launch of the war against Ukraine was entirely unprepared, came as a shock. Now we have this kind of second shock. What is going to reinforce this shock is how the mobilization is proceeding. Complete lack of infrastructure for mobilization, complete lack of military capacity to take in those reluctantly recruited people who are going to generally feed back into to their families. The lack of food, the lack of uniforms, the lack of training, everything. So I think this the social dynamics triggered by this decision on mobilization, we might see snowballing effect in that. So I think it's a major mistake, not only in announcing mobilization, but in announcing it in this particular way, unprepared, unjustified, after all the kind of reassurances that special operation was on track despite the evidence. I'm not entirely in agreement with Andrei's point about Ukraine war. First of all, that the Kremlin is not pushing the idea about Ukraine war. It's still special operation. The word war is still not used, even after Putin's speech 10 days ago. I'm not sure he will use this word tomorrow. So it's still not war. But as far as
special operations in Ukraine.
Yes, but
Ukrainian special.
Yeah, but
okay,
but the term Ukraine war implies anything negative regarding Ukraine. I don't think so. We have Opium War, and we had Crimean War, and we had Vietnam War, which generally are just useful terms. It's not really any negative connotation. It doesn't really put any blame on Ukraine. It's just a term where the war is happening in Ukraine.
Okay, if I may just, why it is important, because it distracts attention from the initiator of the war. And the initiator of the war is Kremlin. Initiator of the war is Putin. Initiator of the war is Russia, whatever, if you even like. So that is why just calling this war Ukrainian war, of special operations definitely, or war in Ukraine, it distracts attention from the real instigator of all this bloodshed and all this crime. So that is why it's necessary in all reasonable discussion, just to and kind of the traditions of it. We have a different names for war. Opium wars. It's not about the territory, about the subject or product. But in most of we have 100 years war. But essentially, the 100 years, England and France at that time was not a kind of finally some kind of nation states as it became later. But now, over the last couple of centuries, so mostly the war is being called by names of participants, if not the World War. Okay, so that is why I would suggest that okay,
Balkan wars.
Okay, because a number of participants, but now that we have two very clear: the aggressor and the victim of aggression. So that is why I would insist that it would be much better title for these military conflicts, as well as for Russian-Georgian conflict, not 5 days war, but Russian-Georgian war. And actually, we know that it was not 5 days. You would just really study the history of the war. So that is why, and this war is already 8.5 years already, and we don't know how long it would continue. So there's a Russian-Ukrainian war, or Kremlin-Ukrainian, or Putin's war against Ukraine, just whatever. But we should not forget about instigator, about who launched this war. So to the first one. So as for Janusz disorganized retreat, we have no sign, no confirmation that the retreat was disorganized. Almost all troops, with very, very few really singular exceptions, left Kharkiv region. The equipment that they left in Kharkiv region is outdated or worn up or so kind of not used or not movable. So just it's kind of with very, very few exceptions. So they took all reasonable and ready equipment. And even by size, once again, they left between 10 or in the worst case, 15% of the equipment. So that is why they did not leave neither personnel nor equipment. So it was a very well organized retreat. And once again, it is a shocking compare, for example, this battle over Liman that is going, actually, it has been started exactly on the same day because it was, according to the Ukrainian military planning, it was a pincer operation. One operation was north of Balaklia from the west to east via towards Kupiansk, and another pincer from south, taking Liman and cutting off Russian troops west of Oskol River. So, and in the same region, not only about talking about what's going on in Kherson or what's going on in Bakhmut, but in the same region, Russians retreated, not having produced any substantial resistance, which was Balaklia, Shirokina, to Kupiansk and to Izium and to Nos. And as we see how bloody battle was unfolding and still is going on over Liman, same district. So that's why no sign of disorganization or fall of morale or some kind of inability to wage a war, nothing. It was a very deliberate decision of the Putin to liberate this northern part of northern eastern part of Kharkiv region and to keep Liman and so on. Okay. Evacuate. Okay, whatever. As for mobilization, that's a very important point that was everybody was discussing. Okay, today the Carl Bildt has tweeted this. Maybe somebody already saw this. According to his, somebody provided to him this number: 1.3 million people left Russia, but this 1.3 million people left from February 24th, not over last week. So certainly this, first of all, it is only just one way, but it did not say how many actually returned. So that is why what is necessary to look into the balance, not in the absolute amount. But even assume that at 1.3 million people, some kind of were running from Putin's mobilization, Putin's war, and so on. Certainly, it's not only men, there was also women and kids and kind of senior people, just all together. But even I will just consider this 1.3 million only men and only of the age that some kind of ready for conscription or for participation in the military conflict. What is the size of official size of Russian mobilization reserve? 18 million. It's we can check it. It could be a larger number, but 18 million is a regular number. So even in this case, the number of people in the in this particular age is 7%, and certainly it is much it's overinflated number. So essentially, it was much lower. So it means that yes, okay, mobilization reserve for Russia has been decreased essentially by 3, 4, in the worst case 5%. So 95% of mobilization reserve is still there in Russia. So that is why, yes, can it have some impact on the capacity, to mobilize personnel?
But there's a psychological capacity as well.
Okay, let me first of all numbers. Okay, psychological is a different piece. I'm economist. Okay, I was taught to deal with numbers. Okay, so first of all numbers. Okay, psychology is a different stuff. Okay, with numbers, so Putin lost during all these iterations, okay, let's say 5% of his mobilization reserve. Whether it affects his, yes, affects 5% less. But if he still have not 18 million, but 17 million, but okay, like 16 million in reserves, whether it's enough, more than enough. And just we've seen all these reports about 300,000 that have been mobilized in the first day. We've seen those reports that they're planning to mobilize 500,000 before the end of the year, another 500,000 next year. I don't know whether it will happen, but it is feasible.
Well, there's another number that they only have capacity polygons enough to train 60 to 90,000
Not
men.
necessarily. They have
And
polygons
20,000
in Ukraine to send these people just to be killed. Once again, you
have to train an army, you need the polygons. If you don't have places to train.
You are talking and thinking as a Western person, completely Western person. Just let me tell you that Mr. Putin does not care about this, okay? So he needs to, and we see those reports that people who have mobilized next day, they have been sent to the front.
True, 2 days of training in their own.
Correct. So that is why he does not need polygons. Right? Okay. So he needs only 18 million Kalashnikov gun. Okay, whether Russia has 18 million Kalashnikov guns, automatic guns, yes. Yes, Russia has slightly more. So that is why I'm talking about the kind of the physical possibility to do it. Yes, this possibility does exist. Whether it will be used fully, we don't know yet. Whether Putin is doing like a serious operation, or is it a huge, unbelievable bluff just to scare the world? We still don't know. We can have this as an option just to think about. But just from the purely some kind of numbers point of view, yes, he has such a capacity.
But let me jump in with numbers also, Andrei. Given the numbers and being very conservative, well, let's say 300,000 being mobilized. If 100,000 have already fled, that's a third of those that could well be mobilized. So if you're saying they have, what, 10 million people or maybe more, well, if a third flee, because that's the proportion, that's on about 3 million people.
Those who fled, they fled before today. As you probably heard, they're going to close the borders.
Yeah.
So that is why it would be much harder to flee. So even the 1/3, but if assume you're right, okay, 1/3 of those people will flee. Okay, instead of 18 million, okay, 6 million people will flee. There will be mobilization reserve 12 million people. 12 million people, if they would be mobilized, once again, potentially, even though nobody mentioned this number, it was more than enough. Right? We know that all Ukrainian army, now they have mobilization, 700,000. So even the current standing Russian army, with the kind of the people under with the rifles, it's kind of 1 million roughly. Mobilization would add 300,000, so 1.3 million, which is roughly speaking twice as many as Ukrainian forces right now. So it's a ratio of 2 to 1. Even they will be equipped with a very old, outdated, not very high level weapons, it still will be the army. It will be not perfect army, but it will be army. And that army is able to kill.
And die.
And die, yes. Okay.
The losses will be massive.
Okay, but for Mr. Putin, it's not a problem. Let me tell you just another.
But he's also going against a very battle-tested, hardened Ukrainian army. That's the very successful, morale's high, and
some of the battle-ready hardened Ukrainian army died during this battle. We need to understand. Those people who have mobilized, they are also yesterday civilians. They were not ready for that. They certainly trained, they prepared. British helped a lot. Poles somehow helped. Germans started to train them. Yes, but
the British trained divisions of Ukrainians have not arrived on the battlefield yet.
Some of them.
They're on their way, though.
Some of
They're
them
on their
already.
way.
At least I saw a report that some of
So
them.
you got Putin mobilizing, you got British trained Ukrainians coming back.
All right, okay, British promised to train about 10,000 in
More
3
than that.
months.
There's
Okay,
more.
okay, initially, all right, okay, so 10,000 very well British trained Ukrainians versus 300,000 Russians not trained by British. We don't know the result of this battle, but we know the number. We can put as it's a very regular discussion or whatever in the general staff on the military. The quality versus quantity versus kind of quality of weapons and so on. All of these arguments are relevant, and nobody knows what will be the result, because who will be right, who will be correct, and what will be morale, what will be psychology here is very important. We don't know, but we cannot ignore numbers. Numbers are very important, because very big number of even poorly trained soldiers, it's still very big army, and it is very dangerous army.
So Andrei,
Well, I
can
think
jump in?
numbers do not make an army. Numbers, you can probably find enough Kalashnikov machine guns, but you don't have much else.
Well,
You cannot feed them, you cannot equip them, there is no artillery for them, there is no tank. Nobody is fighting this army, this war with Kalashnikov guns. I don't think many Kalashnikov guns were really fired.
Pavel,
It's mostly artillery, it's mostly kind of other things. You cannot put these 300,000 as imagine them as real army.
let me just give one historical example. It is not Ukrainians versus Russians. It is Chinese versus Americans.
You mean like the
During
Yalu
Korean War.
River, Korea?
Right, okay. Millions of very poorly trained Chinese with very bad, poor equipment, millions of them swept off North Korea and to get to the 53.
But that's a mistake. I mean, because I'm a military historian. I study Korean War.
Yeah.
And the Chinese, of course, had the numbers, but they were well trained,
Okay,
well
good.
commanded. Although they,
What is the ratio of Chinese troops versus whatever United Nations American troops during this stage of the war?
I mean, during the famous November-December 1950 offensive.
No, not 1950, later. Oh, okay, I'll put it.
Well, the Chinese achieved a breakthrough during the late November 1950 offensive, okay? They managed to infiltrate the thousands of soldiers without anybody able to understand them. All the Chinese, well-trained, well-commanded, they might have poor quality weapons, but they used them effectively, especially mortars. They didn't have radios, but they used the vessels. So they achieved a successful operative plan. They had a good plan, well-trained soldiers, and the end result was the Americans and their allies suffered tremendous casualties.
What is the ratio between the Chinese and American troops?
Well, when you are counting the ratio, you should count the ratio at the front line.
Yes.
Forget about the collective
what is the
numbers.
ratio at the front line?
Well, 6-1.
Okay.
6-1.
6-1.
But don't forget, the thing you are describing related with Russia is not an army, it's a horde.
Okay, it's your view. You have your right to have your view.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's just.
I mean, when you are dealing with it, you need to make use of the tools. I mean, you said, for example, the retreat from Kyiv region was a well-organized. Okay, in a well-organized retreat, no good army left their weapons undamaged. Okay, no good army left their weapon stockpiles undamaged, ammunitions undamaged. Okay, they left hundreds of tanks, and almost all of them, according to the Russian standards, they are most modernized, well-developed tanks. I mean, there are special internet sites like Orange, counting by the videos, photos of the number of the lost Russian equipment. I mean, no war, as far as I know, in modern history, we come across this kind of so many lost equipment, lost weapons, and most of them well-modernized weapons. In an organized retreat, you destroy everything you had difficult to carry, okay? You destroy everything. And if you are not destroying, at least you put some booby traps, mines, something else that when the enemy arrives to get hold of your weapon or ammunition, it will be destroyed, exploded, etc. So what we are seeing is an army completely disintegrated. Soldiers not believing in their commanders, commanders not believing in their generals, generals not believing in the political leaders. What we are seeing, an army disintegrated in front of our eyes. Nobody expected the Russian army to be like that, but I'll tell you one thing. I worked with the Russian army when I was a UN military observer in Abkhazia, 2000, 2001. The Russian army I worked with was so bad that I suffered difficulty to write reports about the condition. Of course, one of the brigade was Maikop brigade, very infamous one, thanks to the first Chechen war. But the another one was a paratroopers, VDV. And they were terrible in every aspect. Soldiers beating their officers, no discipline, everything in shambles. And we as UN observers suffered huge difficulty how we can report all these things. That was 2000, 2001. I was expecting that the Russian army improve later on, but what we are witnessing in Ukraine, it's not an army, it's a horde.
Okay, your point's taken. Let Andrei finish his
Okay.
argument.
Yeah.
It's-
What's your name?
Mesut, M-E-S-U.
Mesut.
Okay. Let me tell you, if you work with Oryx database, you would find that there was no 100 tanks have been captured by Ukrainians. You look into this. I do this. I work with this the database on daily basis, and you would find that during this operation from the September 6th to September 13th, the total number of tanks captured by Ukrainians, not only in Kharkiv but in the whole front line from Kharkiv to Kherson, was slightly more than 80. It was not even 100. But on all fronts, total units of military equipment was 450. Again, for the whole front, not only for this particular area. For this particular area, it will be smaller.
But nowhere else.
Let me finish. Let me finish. No. It's obvious. If you follow this database on a daily basis, they will capture tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces. It's just happening all the time. So that is why if you follow this, you would see it. And there's actually this number that I'm giving you, 450 of total units. This is the highest possible number that you will find, because there are many military experts that they counting each one by one, and they're giving different numbers. 70 units have been captured, 80 units have been captured. Nobody, even at least I haven't seen anyone who would say that they were able to capture more than 100 units of all equipment. Just you check the numbers. You check the.
I'm not agreeing with you.
No, it's not the same.
Anyway,
You can talk with military experts, and this is a very
Okay.
Well,
let's
okay.
finish
Okay.
the next one.
Okay.
Let's kind of move on.
Okay,
So we
yeah.
can just stop.
And now, because we have these 450 units captured, destroyed, damaged for these 3 weeks, for 1 week, from September 6th to September 30th. So, and now we can count how many units of military equipment have been in Kharkiv region. We don't know for sure, but based on the number of troops, based on number of beta Gs, based on number of divisions and so on, we arrive to this number. It will between 3,000 to 4,000 of different units. Tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, trucks, and so on. So that is why you can have very simple math. These 450 units, even all of them, happen to be in the Kharkiv region. It will be between 10 to 15% of all military equipment that have been in that area. It's a very simple math. You can do it yourself. So what I'm saying, all this discussion about the quality of equipment, quality of troops, psychology, morale, all of them very important. But please remember the basic formula of war. The basic formula of war includes all these elements plus number. The not only quality, but quantity of troops, quantity of military equipment, and all the other characteristics. And that is why serious conversation and serious discussion should include all those elements, all those factors that you are mentioning, and you mentioning, that's also important, but also numbers. You cannot ignore one part of the equation and just to work with the other part of the equation. You need to work with all elements, all contributions to this equation. So that is why my point is that yes, the Russian army and the Russian troops are not from some kind of the great quality for the moment. Nobody doubts it, nobody discusses it, but numbers matter. Numbers matters, and number of people are matter. Just please remember that this, whatever horde or whatever you would call this army, not army, was able to capture 20% of the Ukrainian territory. Okay, Ukrainians much better trained, much better equipped, or whatever it is, but who captured the territory? Ukrainians captured Russian territory, or Russians captured Ukrainian territory? Where's the front line? We know where is the front line. Front line is almost all Lugansk Oblast occupied by Russian troops. Okay, the kind of substantial portion of Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast are occupied by Russian troops. Russians still fighting and trying to storm Bakhmut. They attacking. They are on offensive. So just it's not the
Yes, but Ukrainian reports say that they attack, and then 2 days later the Ukrainians counterattack, and then they retake what the Russians.
no, we can discuss this endlessly.
But that's the only area on the front that they're attacking.
Now, but okay, those hundreds of thousands did not arrive to the front yet. So once again,
Okay,
we
we got
know.
that. But what's the next point you want to make? I mean, keep moving. I mean, what was your other, did you have another point you wanted to make?
No, I made this point.
What about the mobilization and protests in Dagestan, burning recruitment centers? I mean, what domestically, what is this? Is this?
Okay, that happens in countries, sometimes it happens, but the question whether it affects the political machine or administrative machine of Putin's regime. I doubt it. Because
No effect.
no, it does not mean no effect. It has some effect, but it does not have great effect.
And what
Whether
about,
it disrupt the machine.
what about the economic effect of all these men, the horde leaving Russia and then also going in the army? What about the intellectual capital that Russia's losing
Look,
economically?
in the war, it is not important what will happen in 5 years' time. What is important what happen tomorrow, day after tomorrow. So if Putin, and looks at before this September 21st, Putin was ready for war of attrition for at least 3 years. Very, very clear indicators. If the question is, will Putin have enough forces, military personnel, equipment, troops, economic power, financial resources for 3 years war? Yes. Absolutely clear. Yes. No doubt. No doubt. Moreover, if we're talking about the political stability, I would just mention what we all know. There was no case of the collapse of totalitarian regime with whatever peaceful protests. Only with force.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so since nobody is
that-
going to attack Russia, and nobody going to use forces against Russia on the Russian territory, and we do not see any sign of military or some kind of any strength, any force within Russia to do this. Tell me, what will be the source of disruption of this political regime in foreseeable future? Question mark.
No effect is what you're saying.
I'm saying limited effect that would not lead to disruption of this political regime.
Okay. You,
Yes.
Pavel, have a counter response, Janusz.
Yes.
I want to take some questions from our guests. Also, if you're watching, you want to ask a question, please do. We'll, we have the section. Are you watching that?
Yeah.
The question section? Yes, go right ahead.
I have a question for Janusz, actually. So
Identify yourself, please.
oh, sorry. Hi, my name's Trevor. I'm a writer at the National Interest. And my question is, if we get away from sort of the minutia of the war and towards, you know, what you were talking about in your book on the potential for the dissolution of Russia, it seems to me the way that you're talking about it is you don't sound very concerned about that. And I'm sort of wondering why not, because in the 90s when like people were talking about this, I guess the prevailing attitude was either one, this was going to turn into Yugoslavia and, you know, all these ethnic groups are going to turn on each other, or two, there were all these nuclear weapons, the world's largest stockpile that, you know, some of them might have gone missing. And so has that changed? What's different between 1991 and 2022?
Yeah, I mean, one should have concern, but concern isn't a policy. one has to be prepared to manage something one doesn't control. We don't control what's going on in Russia. We cannot control. I mean, indirectly we can because of sanctions helping Ukraine on the military side, helping to arm our allies and other partners, yes, but not directly within Russia. That's for the Russians. That's for the Russian citizens to decide. Look, what I do in the book is I outline all the contingencies, all the possibilities, if there is a break in Russia, of what it will mean for neighbors, what it will mean for neighboring countries, the historical relations between across borders that will most probably rise to the forefront, how we should be prepared militarily, because as I say, Russia could, actually I wrote an article for National Interest on this, that Russia could be at the same time as it is splintering, as it is undergoing major internal fracture, could hit out at neighbors. So for which we should be prepared, for which NATO should be prepared, for which we should be prepared with some of our partners, NATO partners as well, in Central Asia, and the Caucasus, Moldova, elsewhere. So yeah, I mean, simply to stop at concern isn't enough. The whole nuclear question Pavel was talking about earlier, I'm not going to say more about this, but look, Soviet Union collapsed and we were fearful of nuclear proliferation. Ukrainians would say,
We spent billions of dollars trying to prevent further proliferation.
yeah, I mean, Ukraine could say now, I wish we hadn't given up those nuclear weapons because we wouldn't have been attacked.
And
But,
it's backfire bombers.
Yeah. So yeah, I personally don't think that a regime that's based on corruption, stolen assets, Putin worried about his health as others, is going to start a nuclear war. They're not nuclear jihadists. They're not going to start a nuclear war with the West. In terms of tactical weapons, tactical nuclear
You're saying
weapons,
Putin's still rational.
yeah, well, depends how you define
He
rational.
bluffs. He bluffs, but
Yeah,
he's also rational.
Yeah, I mean, look, he takes things to the brink. He's trying to frighten the West. He knows how to play the West. He's, you know, it's a KGB guy. He knows how to manipulate people, get the most out of them, for them to submit without him having to actually do anything. So, you know, it's not a question of chess, it's a question of poker, basically.
Well, that's what Bob Gates said. He said Putin plays a weak hand of poker, but he plays it well.
Yeah.
Has anybody got any questions? Yes, go right ahead, please.
Yes, I'm Sam Nishihata from Happy Science USA Bureau.
You're from where?
Happy Science USA Bureau. It's anti-communist organization.
Speak a little louder.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have a question to Dr. Andrei. So you were chief economic advisor to President Putin. So
Not now.
So
Not now.
yeah, you were. So I assume you know Putin very well, and so I'm very curious what Putin is really thinking about. So what is his ultimate purpose of invading Ukraine, and what would you recommend Putin do right now? If you If
If he was in the next
if you
row.
could advise
If he
to
calls you,
Okay.
Putin,
Withdraw all Russian troops from Ukraine, from Moldova, from Georgia, and after that commit suicide.
okay, I can understand.
And that's on the record.
Yes, right here. And do we have any questions from the audience? Are you looking?
Yeah,
No?
yeah.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Byron Challenge about Pavel Partners. I was curious about the comments about everything happening in such a compressed fashion after the meeting with G. Why do you think he wanted that war brought to a close? Why do you think this whole accelerated schedule was put on the table if that was the outcome?
The question is, why is it Britain wanting an accelerated schedule?
No.
The China.
China,
why
because the question was why Chairman Xi wanted.
Yes,
Right.
why does she want him to accelerate?
And then if I may have follow on, this whole question about nuclear weapons, I'm just curious, what's your assessment? Is it a 5% probability? Is it just an impossibility that Putin will not use a number of tactical nuclear weapons as an escalatory?
So the second question is, what is the end game on use of nuclear
A
weapons?
probability. I mean, 0,
Improbability.
5%, 20%.
Is there a 5% chance, 20%, 10, what?
Okay, first of all, concerning the approach from the Chairman Xi, so I don't know what was the reason behind, but it was a very clear and very persistent. Because first of all, we extract this understanding from his body language, from the press releases, from the comments on that. And a week later, or even 10 days later, it has been confirmed by the official press releases from Minister of Foreign Affairs of China. So that is why it looks like we were right by assessing what he told Putin. But we understand that she probably recommended or suggested or some kind of invited Putin to close it as fast as possible. Putin got from this recommendation that he needs to do it, but he needs to finish it with with victory for himself. So that's why he needs to kind of to secure all these territorial acquisitions that he was able to get within the 7+ months of this war. And that is why he's trying to raise stakes to kind of to guarantee. It's my understanding, okay, of that. So if that line of logic is correct, or if it will be correct after some time, and we'll see all that, it means that all these talks about mobilization, it's just bluff. It means that all these people mobilize that they will not be used. They mobilize just to produce it. The more people are around the world are talking about mobilization, more they're talking about those people fleeing Russia, all these stories, that's good. Because Putin, by doing this, produces an impression of he's trying to scare everybody within country, outside of the country, that, okay, he's such a dangerous person, he can mobilize. That is why, for example, leaks officially showed us that 300,000. Immediately they produce a so-called leak that in essence they are trying to mobilize 1 million people. Who can produce this leak? Kremlin, only Kremlin. So that is why it was on purpose that they're going to produce scare. He said about this nuclear, hinted on this nuclear. And after that started all this discussion about nuclear. And Putin is just enjoying by seeing this discussion about nuclear everywhere. Maybe not us, because he did not have much time to watch our session, but essentially he is very much, and actually just look at the timing when he made this statement. He actually, originally he planned to do it on September 20th. And after that, he moved to September 21st. Remember, that was a lot of the question, why? That's very simple. On September 21st, all world dignitaries were gathering in New York. And President Biden was making his speech. So that is why he prepared exactly that everybody in New York would discuss nuclear threat from Putin. That is the purpose. This is a psychological warfare that Glen was talking about. This is a bluff, the highest possible bluff. So that is why, once again, we don't know if, let's say, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, it happened to be that it will appear that he is much more serious than we can try to decipher him today. Okay, that would be a different story. But so far, I don't see any serious preparation for full-scale war because, as Glen has mentioned, okay, not enough polygons. That's true. It's not enough good weapons, which is true. There are some bad weapons, some outdated weapons. Yes, okay, but not enough good weapons. For example, economic mobilization. It did not start. There is no mobilization of Russian economy. The number of military expenditure is unbelievably low, 3.6% of GDP. For the war waged against the country, 3.6% of GDP is a joke. So there are many, and actually they did not close the border for those people fleeing mobilization. If you are serious about mobilization,
Close the border.
the first thing that you close the border. You would not allow to do it. So we can continue with many other observations and science that suggest that it looks like he's not too much serious about that. So that is why your question about nuclear, we don't know, because he not once was able to surprise people. So that is why we cannot say, okay, that's a zero probability. We cannot say so. But I like the answer that General Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian forces, has written in his article that has been published several weeks ago. He said, regardless of Putin's decision, whether he will use nuclear or not use nuclear, we are ready to fight. It does not bother us. It might bother somebody else who would like to, but regardless whether he will use tactical or strategic or whatever, we will be fighting no matter what. So that is why I think it's an absolutely right approach. It's, I would say, Churchillian approach from 1940, from the darkest hour. So regardless what are they going to use and how they're going to use, we will be fighting. We will be fighting on beaches. We will be fighting everywhere. So, but we will never surrender. That's the main message, and I think it's absolutely correct.
Glenn, I think we have an online question.
Yes, there is an online question. Could the speakers explore how China's large influence on Putin, is it exclusively economic, or are there other contributing factors? My name is Paige, and I'm currently a university student at University of Toronto. So why does Putin have this, or why does she have this kind of outsized influence on Putin?
Well, I am not sure it's outsized influence.
Well, that's my term, not hers. So.
Yes, I understand. There is influence, definitely, and there is no friendship. I am confident in that, but China is still a big Russian neighbor, economic giant comparing to Russia, the only strategic partner for Russia, which makes sense. For what little I know from inside, when Putin visited China in February for the Olympic Games, it didn't tell explicitly that he's going to attack. That tells you the limit of that kind of confidence between the two leaders. But in certain situations where Russia is becoming much more dependent on China than it used to be, Xi Jinping's word, yes, carries a lot of weight. And I think one particular word, which is probably given, is about nuclear weapons. And I think this word is don't even think about it.
You think she mentioned that?
Yes.
I can only
Go
say that if somebody has an influence on Putin, it is Chairman Xi, nobody else. And the reason that Putin was developing for last 2 decades special relations with Chinese leadership, regardless who is personally is a occupying position of the chairman, in order to create, develop, strengthen the two-party alliance, Russia-China alliance, with very clear anti-Western direction and attitude. So, and it's clear that Putin overplayed his intentions. So he was much more interested in such strategic alliance as he likes to say and put in all these statements, strategic alliance between Russia and China. And the Chinese side is much more distant from such an understanding. And once again, the last meeting between Xi and Putin in Samarkand clearly showed that Xi does not want to be in strategic partnership with Putin, as Putin wants him to do. So, and Putin sees China as the critical alliance in his so-called Western march against the West. And that is why he's providing whatever sort of diplomatic, psychological support for assumed Xi march on Taiwan. And he some kind of hopes that it will be reciprocal. So if I will help you in your attack on Taiwan, please help me on my attack on Ukraine and on the West. But it's very clear that she does not want to have such reciprocality.
Okay.
Reciprocity.
Okay, well, thank you. If there's no more questions.
Actually, I have one question for Andrei
Okay,
about,
make it quick.
what's a defeat for Putin? You were talking about Melitopol, Mariupol. If they fought Ukrainian forces, what will you do?
I would say, I would reformulate your question. I would say, what is the victory for Ukraine? Yeah, first of all, okay.
Well, to drive all Russian forces out of
No.
Ukraine.
First of all,
Out of Ukraine, going back to
first of all,
February
yeah,
23rd.
for Ukraine, number one is deoccupation of all occupied territories, including Donbas, Crimea, and Sevastopol. It's number one. There is no debate about the line of February 23rd or 24th. It's kind of it's a deviation from the point. Second, to secure that in any foreseeable future, Russia under Putin or under anyone after Putin would not attack Ukraine again. So these two most important conditions for victory of Ukraine. All others, just any some kind of intermediate settlements would only give appetite to Putin or somebody else just to repeat new attacks on Ukraine. So it is not sustainable. So that is why those who are interested in creating stable peace in this part of the world should look for, first of all, deoccupation, and second, creation of whatever arrangement, security arrangements with Russia, with Ukraine, with other countries that would guarantee that Russia under any leadership would not repeat.
Would not have the capability to do it again.
Capability is the result of some particular process, economic process, technological process. Now, what is important is just kind of mentality, that the Russian leadership would refuse to have this part in the mentality to attack aggressively any neighbor along the border. Yeah, it just would be good. No, Ukraine will be first, but it will be the kind of any other neighbor as well, Georgia or Moldova or Belarus or Baltic countries or Kazakhstan, it just doesn't matter.
So you're talking about like in post-World War I, demilitarization of the Rhineland, that type of
I would say, for
buffer
example,
zones.
no, just we can consult with Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin is the best advisor to us in that matter. What he was talking to us last autumn and this winter, he was talking about what is his nightmare scenario.
Oh,
Nightmare scenario is a ballistic missiles, American ballistic missiles on the Ukrainian territory.
Not necessarily ballistic.
Oh, I don't know. He was talking about these kind of just.
He didn't use the word ballistic.
Okay, Mr. Biden was talking that he has no intention to put US ballistic missiles on the US territory. So looks like if just follow this line, if it's a nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles will be deployed on the Ukrainian territory, Mr. Putin would restore his sleep.
restores what?
Sleep, kind of the ability to sleep calmly. So just it would not bother him much. So that is what it would probably, it's one of the elements that would stop his aggressive thinking. Because what is important in this world, especially with the nuclear power, is the risk of response, of retaliation. Not any some kind of security guarantee that could be produced on paper by Mr. Rasmussen or by anybody else. No, the only very clear understanding of retaliation that could be absolutely impossible for
Like mutually assured destruction of sorts.
something like that. Yeah, you got my point. Yes, so that is why. Yeah, it's exactly.
I mean, I've actually heard that term from the Ukrainians. I mean, about developing.
You've heard
about developing their own nuclear capabilities.
once again, it's a technical details, whether it's nuclear or ballistic missile or something else. It's a technical details. What is important, but to have a guaranteed retaliation that is intolerable from the Kremlin's point of view. That's a guarantee for peace. That was a guarantee for peace for 40 years of Cold
That's
War.
true.
Yeah, okay, and it kept peace between two nuclear superpowers quite well. So it looks like that principle can be used in this particular relations.
Okay. But it didn't keep peace between nuclear and non-nuclear.
And that's a different story. Okay, but okay, that's we need to think how to help Ukraine to solve this problem.
Okay, well, on that note, it's 5:10. We appreciate everybody for watching and your patience with Jamestown and this new facility we're using and helping make a very lively and very interesting, fascinating discussion. It'll be posted online. You'll be able to watch it on YouTube. We all took a lot of notes. Andrei, Pavel, and Janusz, thank you for speaking today. And look forward to seeing you again virtually and in person.
Thank you. Thank you.